The salt spray stung Frank Harding's face as he hauled in the fishing net, the rhythmic creak of the winch a familiar comfort. Frank, a name he'd adopted after shedding his past life as Sergeant Major Jason Statham of the SAS, had found a semblance of peace in this remote coastal town. The quiet life of a fisherman, miles away from covert operations and the ever-present threat of death, suited him. His calloused hands, once weapons of precision, now mended nets and baited hooks. The nightmares, though, still visited him in the dead of night. This morning, the catch was meager, mirroring the unsettling feeling that had been nagging at him for days. He felt watched, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his Black Ops days. He dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering echo of a life lived on the edge that he couldn't shake the feeling, though, back at his small, weather-beaten cottage. A single news report flickering on the aged television shattered his fragile tranquility that a bank robbery, brazen and violent, had occurred in the city he deliberately distanced himself from. The headline screamed about millions stolen and several fatalities. Then came the image, a grainy security camera still, undeniably him, wielding a weapon inside the bank. His blood ran cold. It was him, or rather, a perfect double. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the scar above his left eye, a souvenir from a mission gone wrong in Kandahar that he knew instantly he was being framed. Someone was deliberately setting him up, and they were doing a damn good job. Before he could formulate a plan, the tranquility was broken by the screech of tires outside. Black SUVs, their windows tinted, surrounded his cottage. Men in tactical gear, faces obscured by masks, swarmed the property, weapons drawn. There was no escape. That he knew this was coming. Deep down, he didn't resist. Resistance would only validate the false narrative being built against him that he allowed himself to be handcuffed, his mind already racing, calculating angles, assessing threats. As he was hauled into one of the vehicles, he caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the crowd, a man he hadn't seen in years, a man he thought he'd left behind in his old life. Betrayal, sharp and bitter, settled in his gut. The trial was a farce, a carefully orchestrated charade. The evidence was overwhelming, circumstantial but damning. Eyewitness accounts, the security footage, even a recovered firearm with his fingerprints on it. His attempts to explain his innocence were dismissed as the desperate pleas of a hardened criminal. The jury, swayed by the prosecution's narrative and the sheer weight of the fabricated evidence, delivered a guilty verdict within hours. He watched, stone-faced, as the judge pronounced his sentence. Life without parole in Iron Gate Penitentiary, a maximum security prison renowned for its brutality and inescapable design. Iron Gate, they said, was where hope went to die. As the bailiffs led him away, he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of a different kind of war. A war for his freedom, his life, and his very identity. He had to find out who had framed him and why, and he would do it, even if it meant tearing Iron Gate down brick by brick. This is a duplicate request that I'll generate a variation on the previous response, focusing on different details within the same key point. The gavel slammed, a final, brutal punctuation mark on a charade disguised as justice. Frank felt a cold detachment, watching the scene unfold as if he were observing someone else's life crumbling around them. The sentence, life without parole in Iron Gate Penitentiary, barely registered. He'd expected it. The fix was in from the start. Iron Gate. The name conjured images of despair and brutality. Built on a desolate stretch of land, miles from civilization, it was designed to be a black hole, swallowing men whole and erasing them from existence. Its reputation preceded it. A place where the guards were as corrupt as the inmates were ruthless, where violence was the currency of survival, and escape was a whispered fantasy. The trial had been a whirlwind of manufactured evidence and perjured testimony. The prosecution presented a picture of Frank that was a grotesque caricature of the man he was. He was portrayed as a hardened criminal, a menace to society, a man deserving of the harshest punishment. His attempts to defend himself were met with scorn and derision. The judge, clearly biased, ruled against him at every turn. The jury, swayed by the prosecution's relentless campaign of misinformation, delivered their verdict with chilling speed. Guilty. The word echoed in the courtroom, a death sentence masquerading as a legal judgment. Frank felt a surge of anger, but he suppressed it. knowing that any display of emotion would only be used against him. As the bailiffs escorted him from the courtroom, Frank caught the eye of the man he suspected was behind it all, a shadowy figure lurking in the back, his face obscured by the dim light. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and Frank saw a flicker of satisfaction, a cold, calculating triumph. He knew then that this was more than just a frame-up. It was a personal vendetta. The transport to Iron Gate was a grim procession. Shackled and bound, Frank was crammed into a transport van with other newly convicted felons. The air was thick with tension, fear, and the stench of unwashed bodies. The other prisoners eyed him with suspicion, sizing him up, assessing his worth. As the van rumbled towards its destination, Frank used the time to prepare himself mentally for what lay ahead. He knew that Iron Gate would be a brutal and unforgiving environment. He would have to be constantly vigilant, always on his guard. He would have to forge alliances, make enemies, and do whatever it took to survive. The imposing walls of Iron Gate loomed into view, a stark reminder of his captivity. The prison was a fortress, a monument to despair, but Frank refused to be intimidated. He was a survivor, and he would not let Iron Gate break him. He would use his skills, his knowledge, and his unwavering determination to uncover the truth, expose the conspiracy, and reclaim his freedom. The fight had just begun. This is a duplicate request that I'll generate a variation on the previous response, focusing on different details within the same key point. The steel cage rattled shut, a final, deafening clang that sealed Frank's fate within Iron Gate. The initial processing had been a brutal exercise in dehumanization, a stripping away of identity that left him raw and exposed. The atmosphere was thick with dread, a palpable sense of hopelessness that permeated every brick and bar. The prison air was a cocktail of stale sweat, cheap disinfectant, and something acrid, like burnt hope. Sounds echoed unnaturally in the vast, concrete spaces. The constant murmur of hundreds of voices, the clanging of metal doors, the occasional, chilling scream. His arrival was carefully orchestrated to maximize intimidation. He was marched through the main yard during recreation time, a gauntlet of hardened criminals who sized him up with predatory eyes. Tattoos snaked across their skin, telling stories of violence and regret. The air vibrated with unspoken threats. He was summoned to the warden's office shortly after being assigned his cell. Warden Thorne was a hulking figure, his face a mask of cynical amusement. He radiated an aura of quiet menace, a sense that he enjoyed the power he wielded over the lives within his domain. "Harding," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "Welcome to Iron Gate. You're a celebrity now, thanks to that little bank job. But in here, you're just another number, and I control the numbers." Thorne leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "I hear you're a resourceful man, Harding. I like resourceful men. But don't get any ideas about causing trouble. I run this prison, and I don't tolerate insubordination. Understand?" Frank met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Understood." As he was escorted back to his cell, Frank noticed an older inmate watching him from across the yard. The man was gaunt and weathered, but his eyes held a spark of intelligence and a hint of compassion. His name was Silas, a lifer known for his quiet wisdom and his ability to navigate the treacherous currents of prison politics. Later that evening, as the prison settled into an uneasy silence, Silas approached Frank's cell. "New fish," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Word is you're not what you seem." "What do you mean?" Frank asked. "Let's just say I've seen men like you before," Silas replied. "Men who don't belong here. Men with secrets that if you want to survive in this place, you'll need a friend, and I need to know what you're running from." But before Frank could answer, a hulking figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their view. It was Victor, the undisputed king of Iron Gate, a ruthless enforcer with a reputation for brutality. His face was scarred, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "Silas," Victor sneered, "still trying to corrupt the new meat? This one's under my protection now." Victor turned his attention to Frank, his gaze intense and predatory. "You're going to learn the rules of this place, Harding, and the first rule is, you belong to me." The tension in the air was palpable. Frank knew he had just stepped into a deadly game, a struggle for survival that would test his limits and force him to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. He was surrounded by enemies, and he had no idea who he could trust. But he was determined to survive, to uncover the truth, and to escape the clutches of Iron Gate. Victor's claim on Frank was immediately tested. The following morning, during breakfast in the crowded mess hall, a group of Victor's enforcers, led by a hulking brute named Boris, deliberately bumped into Frank, spilling his meager meal onto the floor. "Oops," Boris sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "Looks like you had an accident, new fish. Maybe you should learn to watch where you're going." Frank remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "It was no accident," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Boris chuckled, a guttural sound that echoed through the mess hall. "Oh, really? What are you going to do about it, tough guy?" Before Frank could respond, Silas intervened, placing a hand on Boris's arm. "Leave him alone, Boris," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "He's under Victor's protection." Boris shrugged Silas off, his eyes still fixed on Frank. "Victor can't protect him all the time. Sooner or later, everyone pays their dues in here." The tension in the mess hall was palpable. All eyes were on Frank, waiting to see how he would react. He knew that this was a test, a challenge to his authority. If he backed down now, he would be marked as weak, a target for every predator in Iron Gate. He took a deep breath, his mind racing, calculating the odds. He was outnumbered, but he had faced worse before. He had been trained to kill, to survive in the most hostile environments. He was not afraid. "I'm not looking for trouble," Frank said, his voice calm but resolute. "But I won't be pushed around." Boris grinned, revealing a mouthful of yellowed teeth. "Those are brave words. New fish. Let's see if you can back them up." Boris lunged at Frank, throwing a wild punch. Frank sidestepped the blow with ease, his movements fluid and precise. He grabbed Boris's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him into the nearest table. The mess hall erupted in chaos. Inmates scrambled to get out of the way as Frank and Boris engaged in a brutal brawl. Frank, drawing on his years of training and experience, fought with a ferocity that surprised everyone. That he moved with lightning speed, delivering precise blows that quickly disabled his opponent's point one by one. Boris's enforcers joined the fray, but Frank was too skilled, too determined. He dodged punches, blocked kicks, and retaliated with devastating efficiency. Within minutes, the mess hall was littered with bodies, and Frank stood victorious, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken. The guards, who had initially stood back and watched the fight unfold, finally intervened, firing tear gas into the mess hall and restoring order. Frank was dragged to solitary confinement, his body aching, his mind racing. The brawl had sent a clear message throughout Iron Gate. Frank Harding was not to be trifled with. He had earned the respect of some inmates, but he had also made powerful enemies. Victor would not take this challenge to his authority lightly, and Warden Thorne would be watching him closely, waiting for him to make a mistake. His life in Iron Gate had just become a lot more complicated than in solitary. The guards made his life hell. Sleep deprivation, reduced rations, and constant harassment were the tools they used to try and break him. They knew he was different, that he posed a threat to the established order. But Frank refused to yield. He used the isolation to clear his mind, to hone his senses, to plan his next move. That he knew that his survival depended on his ability to outsmart his enemies, to exploit their weaknesses, and to find a way out of Iron Gate. Solitary confinement, despite its brutal conditions, offered Frank an unexpected advantage. Time to think, to analyze, to sift through the fragmented memories of his past, searching for clues, for a connection, for anything that could explain why he was in Iron Gate. That he replayed the trial in his mind, scrutinizing every detail, every witness statement, every piece of evidence. That he noticed inconsistencies, subtle but telling discrepancies that pointed to a deliberate manipulation of the truth. The security footage, for instance, was conveniently grainy, obscuring key details, making positive identification difficult. The eyewitness accounts, while damning, seemed oddly rehearsed, as if the witnesses had been coached on what to say. And then there was the firearm, the one with his fingerprints on it. He had never seen that weapon before in his life. It was a classic frame job. But who had the resources, the connections, to pull it off? As the days turned into weeks, Frank began to suspect that his framing was not simply a matter of mistaken identity or random chance. That it was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy designed to silence him, to eliminate him from the equation. But why? What secret was he protecting? What truth was he close to uncovering? He racked his brain, trying to recall any events, any encounters, any investigations that might have triggered this elaborate scheme. His past life as an SAS operative was filled with dangerous missions and powerful enemies. He had made a lot of enemies, but none that he thought would go to such lengths to destroy him. Then, a memory surfaced, a fleeting recollection of a conversation he had overheard years ago, a hushed discussion between two high-ranking officials about a covert operation gone wrong. The operation involved the illegal transportation of weapons to a volatile region, a violation of international law. Frank had dismissed it at the time, but now, in the confines of his solitary cell, it took on a new significance. Could it be that he had stumbled upon something that someone wanted to keep buried? Could it be that his silence had become a threat to powerful individuals? He needed more information, more evidence. He needed to find a way to communicate with the outside world, to reach out to someone he could trust. But that seemed impossible. He was trapped in Iron Gate, cut off from all contact with the outside world. Then, one day, during his brief exercise period in the prison yard, he encountered Silas. Silas, despite his advanced age and frail appearance, possessed a network of contacts within the prison, inmates who were willing to take risks, to bend the rules, to help those in need. "I need your help, Silas," Frank said, his voice low and urgent. "I need to get a message out." Silas nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know a guy," he said. "He works in the laundry that he can smuggle messages out, but it will cost you." "I don't have anything to offer," Frank said. "You have information," Silas replied. "That's more valuable than money in here." Frank hesitated. He wasn't sure if he could trust Silas completely. But he had no other choice. He told Silas about the conversation he had overheard, about the illegal weapons operation, about his suspicion that he was framed to protect those involved. Silas listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. "This is dangerous information, Frank," he said. "If you're right, you've made some powerful enemies. Be careful who you trust in here. There are ears everywhere." Silas agreed to help Frank get his message out, but he warned him that the risks were high. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. But Frank was determined to uncover the truth. No matter the cost, he was ready to take the risk. The conspiracy had taken everything from him. Now, he was going to take everything from them. Back in general population, Frank maintained a cautious distance from Victor and his crew, while subtly observing Silas, trying to gauge his trustworthiness. He knew that in a place like Iron Gate, alliances were fragile, and betrayal was always a possibility. He needed to be sure that Silas was genuinely on his side before he fully committed to their partnership. Silas, for his part, seemed to understand Frank's reservations. That he didn't push, didn't demand trust, but instead offered small gestures of support, a quiet word of warning, a discreet piece of information. That he pointed out blind spots in the security system, weaknesses in the prison's infrastructure, and the patterns of the guards' patrols. "Thorn is predictable," Silas explained one day, during their brief meeting in the yard. "He's a creature of habit. He follows the same routine every day, the same route, the same times. And he's greedy. He can be bought, but the price is high." Silas revealed that Thorn was deeply involved in the prison's black market, taking kickbacks from Victor for allowing him to control the flow of drugs and contraband. He also had a side business selling off prison supplies and embezzling funds. "He thinks he's untouchable," Silas said. "But everyone has a weakness. Thorn's is his greed." Silas also shared his knowledge of the prison's layout, its hidden tunnels, its forgotten passageways. He had spent decades in Iron Gate, and he knew every nook and cranny, every secret, and every shortcut. "This place is a maze," Silas said. "But I know the way out. Or at least, I know parts of the way." As Frank spent more time with Silas, he began to see a different side to the older inmate. Beneath the weathered exterior and the world-weary cynicism, there was a deep well of intelligence, compassion, and resilience. Silas had survived Iron Gate for so long because he was smart, adaptable, and fiercely determined. Frank realized that Silas was not just a source of information. He was a mentor, a guide, a potential ally in his fight for survival. He decided to take the risk and fully trust him. "I'm in," Frank said to Silas one evening, as they stood near the edge of the yard, the shadows deepening around them. "I trust you." What's the plan? Silas smiled, a rare and genuine expression that lit up his face. The plan, he said, is to get you out of here, but it's not going to be easy. Thorn is watching you. Victor is circling, and the whole prison is a trap waiting to be sprung. Silas explained that escaping Iron Gate would require careful planning, meticulous execution, and a little bit of luck. They would need to gather information, acquire resources, and exploit every weakness in the prison's security. We'll need to find a way to get past the guards, through the walls, and over the wire, Silas said. And we'll need to do it without getting caught. Frank knew that the odds were stacked against them, but with Silas's knowledge and his own skills, he believed that they had a chance. They were an unlikely team, a hardened SAS operative and a grizzled lifer, but they shared a common goal, freedom, and they were willing to risk everything to achieve it. The alliance was formed, the plan was set in motion, and the countdown to escape had begun. With the alliance solidified, Frank and Silas began meticulously planning their escape. Silas provided the intimate knowledge of Iron Gate, the secret passages, the guard rotations, the blind spots in the surveillance system. Frank, drawing on his SAS training, translated that knowledge into a workable escape strategy. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They would exploit a series of weaknesses in the prison's security, moving through the bowels of Iron Gate, bypassing the main checkpoints, and ultimately breaching the outer walls under the cover of darkness. The first step was acquiring the necessary resources. They needed tools, weapons, and a means of communicating with the outside world. Silas, with his extensive network of contacts, began to discreetly gather what they needed. A sharpened spoon became a makeshift knife. Scraps of fabric were woven into rope that a smuggled transistor radio provided a tenuous link to the outside world. Frank focused on the tactical aspects of the escape that he studied the blueprints of the prison, committing every detail to memory that he analyzed the guard rotations, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities that he devised a plan to disable the surveillance cameras, using a combination of stealth and ingenuity. We need to create a diversion, Frank said to Silas one evening, as they huddled in a hidden corner of the yard. Something that will draw the guards' attention away from our escape route. Silas suggested setting fire to the prison laundry, a chaotic event that would require a significant response from the guards. That IT was risky, but it was their best option. We'll need someone on the inside to start the fire, Silas said. Someone we can trust. They recruited a disgruntled inmate named Mickey, a pyrotechnic expert who had a vendetta against the prison administration. Mickey agreed to set the fire, in exchange for a promise of protection once they were on the outside. The next challenge was breaching the outer walls. The walls were heavily fortified, topped with razor wire and patrolled by armed guards. They needed a way to scale the walls without being detected. Frank devised a plan to use the prison's plumbing system to their advantage. That he had discovered a network of underground tunnels that ran beneath the walls. They could use these tunnels to approach the walls undetected, and then use a makeshift grappling hook to scale the wire. It's going to be tight, Frank said. The tunnels are narrow and cramped, and there's a risk of collapse. We don't have a choice, Silas replied. It's our only shot. As the days counted down, the tension within Iron Gate grew. Rumors of an impending escape spread through the inmate population, fueling speculation and anxiety. Thorn, sensing that something was amiss, tightened security, increasing patrols and conducting random searches. Frank and Silas knew that they were running out of time. They needed to act soon. Before Thorn discovered their plan, they set a date for the escape. A moonless night when the darkness would provide them with the cover they needed. The plan was intricate, audacious, and incredibly dangerous, but it was their only hope. Thorn, a shrewd and ruthless man, wasn't oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that had gripped Iron Gate. He'd sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the hushed conversations, the furtive glances. He knew something was brewing, and he suspected that Frank Harding was at the center of it. Thorn had done his research on Frank. That he knew about his past as an SAS operative, his skills, his resourcefulness, his unwavering determination. That he recognized that Frank was not just another inmate. He was a threat, a force to be reckoned with. Driven by a mixture of paranoia and self-preservation, Thorn initiated a series of countermeasures designed to disrupt Frank's plans and reassert his control over Iron Gate. He increased the frequency of guard patrols, particularly in the areas that Silas had identified as security blind spots. He ordered random cell searches, confiscating anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool. He even tightened the screws on Victor, demanding a larger cut of the profits from the prison's black market, putting pressure on the kingpin to keep order among his ranks. Thorne also began to subtly harass Frank. Hoping to provoke him into making a mistake, he reassigned him to the most dangerous work details, placing him in direct contact with hostile inmates. He ordered the guards to subject him to constant scrutiny, to deny him privileges, to make his life as miserable as possible. One day, while Frank was working in the prison kitchen, Thorne paid him a visit. He stood over Frank, his eyes filled with contempt. "I know what you're planning, Harding," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "You think you can outsmart me, but you're wrong that I control everything in here. There's no escape from Iron Gate." Frank remained silent, his expression unreadable. He refused to give Thorne the satisfaction of seeing him react. Thorne smiled, a cruel and predatory expression. "I'm going to make an example of you, Harding," he said. "I'm going to show everyone what happens to those who defy me." Thorne ordered the guards to transfer Silas to a different cell block, isolating him from Frank and disrupting their communication. He also planted a snitch in Frank's cell, an informant who would report on his every move. The pressure was mounting. Frank knew that Thorne was closing in, tightening the noose around him. He needed to act quickly. Before Thorne completely dismantled their escape plan, he and Silas managed to exchange a few coded messages through their contacts, confirming that they needed to move up the date of the escape. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. But Thorne was one step ahead. He had anticipated their move and set a trap that on the night of the planned escape, as Frank and Silas prepared to make their move, Thorne unleashed his forces. The prison erupted in chaos as guards stormed the cell blocks, conducting surprise searches and arresting anyone suspected of involvement in the escape plot. Frank and Silas found themselves surrounded, their plan crumbling around them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. The escape had become a desperate fight for survival. The chaos of the raid was a smokescreen, a distraction from the true betrayal. As Frank and Silas fought their way through the prison, dodging guards and evading capture, they realized that someone had deliberately sabotaged their plan, feeding information to Thorne. Suspicion immediately fell on Mickey, the pyrotechnic expert they had recruited to set the laundry on fire. But Mickey swore he hadn't betrayed them. He claimed that someone had overheard their conversation, someone they both trusted. Then it hit Frank. The snitch in his cell wasn't just reporting on his movements. He was actively manipulating him, subtly steering him towards a trap. And the only person who had access to him, the only person he had confided in, was Silas. The realization was like a punch to the gut. Frank had trusted Silas implicitly, relying on his knowledge and experience. That he had believed that they were partners, united in their quest for freedom. But now he saw Silas in a new light, a manipulative old con who had been playing him from the start. "Silas," Frank said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me you didn't betray us." Silas avoided Frank's gaze, his face etched with guilt. "I had no choice, Frank," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thorne threatened my family. He said he would hurt them if I didn't cooperate." Frank felt a surge of anger, but he suppressed it. He knew that dwelling on Silas's betrayal would only distract him from their immediate goal, survival. They were surrounded by enemies, and they needed to focus on escaping. "I understand," Frank said, his voice cold and detached. "But from now on, you're on your own." Frank abandoned Silas, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions. He knew that it was a harsh decision, but he couldn't afford to carry any dead weight. That he needed to be ruthless, to prioritize his own survival. Alone and hunted, Frank was forced to improvise. He abandoned their original escape route, relying on his instincts and his training to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of Iron Gate. He used stealth and cunning to evade the guards, disabling security cameras and creating diversions. He encountered Victor and his crew, who saw him as a threat to their power. They tried to ambush him, but Frank was too quick, too skilled. He fought them off, leaving a trail of battered bodies in his wake. He reached the outer walls, only to discover that Thorne had reinforced the security, adding extra layers of razor wire and doubling the number of guards. The plumbing tunnels were flooded, making them impassable. The escape seemed impossible, but Frank refused to give up that he had come too far. Sacrificed too much that he was determined to escape Iron Gate. No matter the cost, he found a new route. A forgotten service tunnel that led to the prison's power plant. He knew that the power plant was heavily guarded, but it was his only chance that he would have to fight his way through. Using all his skills and all his resources, the escape had become a desperate, last-ditch effort, a gamble with everything on the line. The power plant loomed before him, a hulking concrete structure humming with dangerous energy. Frank knew that getting inside would be a suicide mission, but he had no other choice. He was out of options, out of time, and running on pure adrenaline. He slipped into the shadows. Using the darkness to his advantage, he moved silently, like a ghost, his senses heightened, his every muscle coiled and ready to strike. He reached the perimeter fence, a chain-link barrier topped with razor wire. He used his makeshift knife to cut through the wire, creating a small opening just large enough to squeeze through. Inside the perimeter, he encountered a guard patrolling the area. Frank quickly assessed the situation, calculating the distance, the angle, the guard's movements. He waited for the opportune moment, then struck with lightning speed. He tackled the guard from behind, silencing him with a swift blow to the head. He stripped the guard of his uniform and his weapon, a rusty old service pistol, disguised as a guard. Frank moved deeper into the power plant. He navigated the maze of pipes, wires, and machinery, his mind racing, his senses on high alert. He encountered more guards, but he managed to evade them. Using stealth and deception, that he reached the main control room, the heart of the power plant. Inside, he found a group of technicians monitoring the equipment. He knew that he had to disable the power plant to create the chaos he needed to make his escape. He burst into the control room, his weapon drawn. "Everyone down," he shouted, his voice filled with authority. The technicians froze, their eyes wide with fear. They obeyed his command, dropping to the floor. Frank quickly disabled the power plant's main generators, plunging the prison into darkness. Alarms blared, lights flickered, and the entire facility descended into pandemonium. That he used the chaos as cover, making his way towards the emergency exit. But as he reached the door, he was confronted by a group of guards, led by Captain Miller, Thorne's right-hand man. "Harding," Miller said, his voice filled with contempt. "I knew you'd try something like this." A fierce firefight erupted. Frank, using his training and his skills, fought with a ferocity that surprised the guards. He dodged bullets, returned fire, and used improvised weapons to disable his opponents. He grabbed a fire extinguisher, spraying a cloud of foam into the guards' faces, blinding them. He used a wrench to knock them unconscious. That he fought his way through the guards, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. That he reached the emergency exit and burst out into the night. That he was free, but he knew that he was far from safe. Thorne would be hunting him, and he would stop at nothing to bring him back. The escape had begun, but the fight was far from over. Even as the alarms blared and chaos reigned, Frank knew he hadn't truly escaped the clutches of Iron Gate. The power plant was still within the prison walls, a temporary sanctuary before the true challenge began. As he moved through the darkened corridors, a familiar, menacing figure materialized from the shadows. Victor, the Kingpin's face was contorted with rage, his eyes burning with a primal fury. Frank's escape had not only disrupted the prison's order, but had directly threatened Victor's control, his lucrative black market, and his carefully cultivated power base. "You think you can just walk out of here?" Victor snarled, his voice a guttural rumble. "You think you can disrespect me and get away with it?" Victor was surrounded by his loyal enforcers, hulking figures armed with makeshift weapons, shivs, clubs, and lengths of sharpened metal. Frank was outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but he refused to back down. "This isn't about you, Victor," Frank said, his voice calm and resolute. "This is about my freedom." "Freedom?" Victor scoffed. "There's no freedom in here, there's only power, and you're about to learn what it means to challenge me." Victor lunged at Frank, swinging a heavy metal pipe. Frank dodged the blow with lightning speed, his reflexes honed by years of training and combat. He retaliated with a series of precise strikes, disabling Victor's enforcers one by one. The fight was brutal and unforgiving. Frank and Victor exchanged blows, each strike carrying the weight of years of pent-up rage and frustration. Frank used his superior skills and tactics to gain the upper hand. But Victor was a formidable opponent, his raw strength and sheer brutality making him a dangerous adversary. They grappled, wrestling each other to the ground, their bodies slick with sweat and blood. Frank managed to disarm Victor, but the Kingpin continued to fight, using his fists, his elbows, his knees. The fight spilled out into the main power plant chamber, where sparks flew from damaged equipment and the air crackled with electricity. The alarms continued to blare, adding to the cacophony of violence. Frank knew that he had to end the fight quickly. The guards would be converging on the power plant soon, and he couldn't afford to be caught in the middle of a brawl. That he saw an opportunity and seized it. He grabbed a loose electrical cable, wrapped it around Victor's neck, and tightened his grip. Victor struggled, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging. Frank held on tight, refusing to release his grip. That he knew that he was close to killing Victor, but he couldn't bring himself to cross that line. That he was not a murderer. Finally, Victor lost consciousness, his body limp and lifeless. Frank released the cable and stepped back, his chest heaving, his body trembling. That he had defeated Victor, but he knew that his victory was only temporary. The Kingpin would recover, and he would seek revenge. But Frank couldn't worry about that now. That he had to focus on escaping Iron Gate. He left Victor lying on the floor of the power plant and continued his desperate flight towards freedom. He knew that he was running out of time, and he knew that the odds were stacked against him. But he refused to give up. He would escape Iron Gate, even if it meant dying in the attempt. The power plant's emergency exit led into a service yard, a dimly lit area used for storage and maintenance. Frank knew that the outer walls were close, but the yard was heavily guarded, with checkpoints strategically positioned to control access. He had to find a way to bypass these checkpoints without being detected. He noticed a stack of empty crates near the perimeter fence. He had an idea. He quickly climbed onto the crates, using them as a makeshift ladder to reach the top of the fence. He peered over the fence, surveying the area beyond. He saw a network of service tunnels that ran beneath the yard, connecting the power plant to the main prison complex. He knew that these tunnels were rarely used, but they offered a potential route to the outer walls. That he climbed down from the fence and began searching for an entrance to the tunnels. He found a hidden hatch beneath a pile of debris. That he lifted the hatch and climbed down into the darkness. The tunnels were narrow and cramped, filled with pipes, wires, and stagnant water. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. Frank moved slowly, carefully, his senses on high alert. He knew that he was vulnerable in these tunnels, exposed and alone. That he encountered a series of obstacles, locked gates, blocked passageways, and flooded sections. But he used his skills and his resourcefulness to overcome them. He picked locks with his makeshift knife, cleared debris with his bare hands, and waded through the water, his body shivering with cold. He reached a major security checkpoint, a heavily fortified gate manned by armed guards. He knew that he couldn't simply walk through the gate. He would be immediately recognized and apprehended. He noticed a ventilation shaft above the gate. He had an idea. He climbed onto a stack of pipes and reached for the shaft. He managed to pry open the cover and squeeze inside. The ventilation shaft was narrow and dusty, filled with cobwebs and debris. Frank crawled through the shaft, his body contorted, his lungs burning. He reached a point directly above the gate. He peered down through the grate. He saw the guards below, chatting and laughing. Oblivious to his presence, he waited for the opportune moment, then dropped down from the shaft. Landing silently behind the guards, he quickly disabled the guards. Using his martial arts skills and his improvised weapons, he took their weapons and their uniforms. Disguised as a guard, he opened the gate from the inside, allowing himself to pass through the checkpoint undetected. He continued his journey through the tunnels, his heart pounding, his mind racing. That he finally reached the outer walls, a towering barrier of concrete and steel, topped with razor wire and patrolled by armed guards. He knew that this was the final obstacle, the last hurdle between him and freedom. That he took a deep breath, steeled his resolve, and prepared for the final assault. He was going to breach those walls, no matter the cost. The outer walls loomed, a final, imposing barrier. Frank knew that Thorn would be waiting for him. that this was where the game would end. He also knew that the message he had sent with Silas's contact had reached its destination. Help was on its way, but he needed to buy time. As he prepared to scale the wall, a spotlight snapped on, blinding him. That a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. Harding, this is your last chance. Surrender now, and I promise you a fair trial. Frank knew that Thorne's promise was a lie. He would never let him leave Iron Gate alive. He ignored the command and began to climb the wall, his hands gripping the rough concrete, his body straining with effort. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the wall above him. It was Thorne, his face contorted with rage, a high-powered rifle in his hands. You should have listened to me, Harding, Thorne shouted. Now you're going to die. Thorne fired, but Frank dodged the bullet. Narrowly avoiding being hit, he continued to climb, his movements swift and precise. Thorne fired again and again, but Frank managed to evade the shots. Using his agility and his training to stay alive, he reached the top of the wall and confronted Thorne. It's over, Thorne, Frank said, his voice calm but resolute. You can't stop me. I can and I will, Thorne replied, his eyes filled with hatred. You're going to pay for everything you've done. Thorne lunged at Frank, swinging his rifle like a club. Frank dodged the blow and disarmed Thorne, sending the rifle flying over the wall. A fierce hand-to-hand fight ensued. Frank and Thorne exchanged blows, each strike carrying the weight of years of corruption and betrayal. Thorne was a powerful man, but Frank was more skilled, more determined. You framed me, Thorne, Frank said, his voice filled with anger. What? Because you knew too much, Thorne replied, his voice gasping for breath. You knew about the weapons shipments, about the bribes, about everything. I had to silence you. Who ordered you to frame me? Frank demanded. Thorne hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. I can't tell you, he said. They'll kill me. They'll kill you anyway, Frank replied. Unless you tell me the truth. Thorne finally cracked. He revealed the names of the powerful figures who had orchestrated the frame-up, politicians, businessmen, and military officials who were all involved in the illegal weapons trade. As Thorne spoke, a helicopter appeared overhead, its searchlight illuminating the wall. A voice boomed from the helicopter. Frank Harding, this is the authorities. We have a warrant for your arrest. Put down your weapon and surrender. Frank ignored the command. He knew that the authorities were not there to help him. They were there to silence him, to protect the powerful figures who had framed him. He turned his attention back to Thorne. It's over, Thorne, he said. You're going to pay for your crimes. Frank knocked Thorne unconscious. Leaving him lying on the wall, he then jumped down from the wall, landing safely on the ground below. He was free, but he knew that his fight was far from over. He had a lot of work to do to clear his name and expose the conspiracy. The final showdown had revealed the depth of the corruption, fueling his determination to bring the conspirators to justice. Frank landed hard on the other side of the wall, the impact jarring his bones. He was bruised, battered, and exhausted, but he was freed. He was out of Iron Gate. The alarm still blared, and the helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight cutting through the darkness. He knew that he had to move quickly, to disappear before the authorities could close in. He ran into the nearby woods. Using the trees and the shadows as cover, he heard the sounds of pursuit, the barking of dogs, the shouts of guards. He knew that they were closing in, that he had to find a way to escape their grasp. He came across a deserted road. He saw a parked car in the distance. He approached the car cautiously, his senses on high alert. He saw that the car was unlocked, with the keys still in the ignition. He knew that it was a risk, but he had no other choice. He jumped into the car and started the engine. He sped away, leaving Iron Gate behind. He drove through the night, his mind racing, his body aching. He knew that he was a fugitive, wanted by the authorities, hunted by the powerful figures who had framed him, but he was determined to clear his name, to expose the conspiracy, to bring the conspirators to justice. As he drove, he listened to the radio. He heard news reports about the escape from Iron Gate, about the chaos and the violence, about the manhunt for Frank Harding. He also heard reports about the allegations of corruption within the prison system, about the illegal weapons trade, about the powerful figures who were implicated. The message he had sent with Silas's contact had worked. The truth was out. The world was finally learning about the corruption and the conspiracy that had led to his imprisonment. He knew that his escape had not only freed him but had also exposed the rot at the heart of Iron Gate. The prison system would never be the same. Thorne's corruption was out in the open, and the powerful figures who had supported him were now facing scrutiny. As dawn broke, Frank reached a small town. He parked the car and went into a diner. He ordered a coffee and a meal. He watched the news on the television. He saw images of Iron Gate, of the chaos and the destruction. He saw images of Thorne being led away in handcuffs. He saw images of himself, a wanted fugitive. He knew that his fight was far from over. He had cleared the first hurdle, escaping from Iron Gate and exposing the conspiracy. But he still had to prove his innocence, to clear his name, to bring the conspirators to justice. He finished his meal and left the diner. He knew that he was being watched, that the authorities were closing in. He had to disappear, to go underground, to prepare for the next stage of his fight. He walked into the shadows, disappearing into the anonymity of the town. He was a fugitive, a wanted man, but he was also a force to be reckoned with. He was Jason Statham, and he would not rest until he had cleared his name and brought the conspirators to justice. Iron Gate was behind him, but the world was now his battleground. Weeks turned into months. Frank, now a ghost, moved across the country, staying one step ahead of the authorities and the shadowy figures who still wanted him silenced. He adopted new identities, learned new skills, and honed his instincts. He was a chameleon, blending into the background, always watching, always planning. He used the information he had extracted from Thorne to begin his investigation. He started by targeting the lower-level players, the corrupt officials, the crooked businessmen, the military officers who had been involved in the illegal weapons trade. He gathered evidence, documented their crimes, and exposed their corruption. He leaked information to the media, triggering investigations and sparking public outrage. One by one, the conspirators began to fall, their careers ruined, their reputations tarnished, their lives destroyed. But Frank knew that he had to go after the top dogs, the powerful figures who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. These were men and women who controlled vast fortunes, wielded immense political power, and commanded armies of loyal followers. They were ruthless, cunning, and incredibly dangerous. He tracked them down, one by one, infiltrating their inner circles, uncovering their secrets, and exposing their lies. He used their own weapons against them, turning their allies into enemies, their friends into foes. He faced betrayals, setbacks, and near-death experiences. He was hunted, ambushed, and tortured. But he refused to give up. He was driven by a burning desire for justice, a relentless determination to clear his name and avenge the wrongs that had been done to him. As he closed in on the final conspirator, he received a message from an unexpected source. Silas, the old inmate, had managed to survive Iron Gate, and he had information that could help Frank expose the final player. Silas revealed that the mastermind behind the conspiracy was a powerful senator, a man who had built his career on lies and deceit. The senator had used his influence to protect the illegal weapons trade, to silence anyone who threatened to expose him, and to frame Frank for the bank robbery. Frank knew that he had to confront the senator to bring him to justice. He tracked him down to his secluded estate, a fortress of wealth and security. He infiltrated the estate, bypassing the guards and the surveillance systems. He confronted the senator in his study, a room filled with books, trophies, and symbols of power. The senator was a frail old man, but his eyes were filled with a cold, calculating intelligence. "You can't win, Harding," the senator said, his voice calm and controlled. "I'm too powerful. I have too many friends that you'll never be able to touch me." "I've already touched you," Frank replied, his voice filled with determination. "I've exposed your crimes, ruined your reputation, and destroyed your empire. All that's left is to bring you to justice." Frank presented the senator with the evidence he had gathered, the documents, the recordings, the testimonies. The senator denied everything, but Frank knew that he was cornered. As the authorities closed in, the senator made a desperate attempt to escape, but Frank stopped him. A final confrontation, a struggle for justice. The senator was apprehended, his crimes exposed, his power stripped away. Frank had cleared his name, exposed the conspiracy, and brought the conspirators to justice. He was finally free. But he knew that the world was still filled with corruption and injustice. That he knew that his fight would never truly be over. He was Jason Statham, and he would continue to fight for what was right, to protect the innocent, and to bring the guilty to justice. His story was far from over, setting the stage for new battles, new enemies, and new challenges. The world needed him, and he was ready to answer the call.